hidden gem. It was created in 2019, and our primary purpose is comedy for everyone. We do comedy shows every Friday night, family friendly at 7, and then stand-up comedy at 8:30. So if you guys take away anything besides this fantastic lecture, keep in mind you're welcome back here into the theater every Friday night for shows. And we also do private events. We do public events. We just have all sorts of manners. If you can think of a way to use a 75-seat theater, just let me know. I own the building, and I'm so thankful that you guys came tonight, and I want to hand it back over. Thank you.
Not a lecture. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us. This is the inaugural event for our From the Ground Up speaker series. From the Ground Up is a speaker series that approaches pressing issues in Omaha from a unique angle. So it's a panel discussion with content experts and neighborhood organizers. And the idea is to lay the groundwork for proper advocacy and making change. So for 2023, our focus for From the Ground Up is housing. And we're going to have 3 series. This first one is laying the historical context. So why does Omaha look the way that it looks today? Our next series is going to be on October 10th, and that one's going to explore different tensions in housing development. And then our third event will be on November 14th, and that's going to explore different methods for community-based development. So we got a lot coming up, and really thank all of you for being here tonight. A couple of things, please silence your cell phones. We've got waters in the back. If you need to use the restrooms, they're through this door. And then I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Kimara Snipes, the new executive director at One Omaha. Let's give her a round of applause. So Kimara needs a little introduction, but I will note that she's been a neighborhood organizer for over 20 years in Omaha, and we're really excited to have her here with us at One Omaha, and we're excited to have her here tonight to lead our discussion. Thanks, Kimara.
Thank you, Alex. Good evening, y'all. I am once again just very excited to be in this space tonight. I have been just truly overjoyed these past few months being in this position, so I'm just really grateful. I'm really excited to be here with all of you tonight, our panelists as well, to really learn more from our panel of experts about the history of housing development here in Omaha, Nebraska. Our panelists are Dr. Terri Crawford, Steve Jensen, and Preston Love Jr. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about all of them and their backgrounds. You can also find this information by scanning the QR code that is right here on the screen. So Dr. Terri Crawford is a community fellow for UNO's Service Learning Academy and an instructor in the Black Studies Department. She leads at the intersection of social justice, community engagement, some of my favorite words, and public policy, culminating over 2 decades of experience with her passion for achieving a more just world. She's also on the governing board of the new documentary Divisible. If you have not seen it, I suggest that you do, and provides in-depth tours of the Undesigned, the Redline exhibit at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Dr. Terri Crawford. Steve Jensen is a planning and urban design consultant. He spent 35 years with the Omaha City Planning Department before retiring after serving several years as director. His accomplishments include directing the most comprehensive update of the city's master plan in Omaha's history, annexation of the city of Elkhorn, and the award-winning Urban Design Master Plan, Urban Design Code, and 2009 Downtown Omaha Master Plan. And last, but most certainly not least, Preston Love Jr. is the founder and CEO of the Institute for Urban Development, an Omaha nonprofit dedicated to developing urban communities through engagement, economic growth initiatives, leadership growth, and get out the vote initiatives. He brings the wisdom derived from his life experiences, his crusade in community activism for economic inclusion to his work, with many years of social justice organizing experience and deep knowledge of Omaha's history. Preston Love. So welcome again to our panelists. I would also like to take a little bit of time to recognize our From the Ground Up sponsors, whose support is really instrumental in allowing One Omaha to put on impactful programming that empowers residents to develop thriving neighborhoods throughout our entire city. We have First National Bank of Omaha, Builder Trend, Omaha Public Power District, Metropolitan Area Planning Agency, and the South Omaha Neighborhood Alliance. And of course, we also want to thank the Blackstone Theater for hosting this event this evening. Can we give them some applause? Finally, I just want to take a little personal privilege to recognize my team at One Omaha. Alex O'Hanlon is our engagement manager. Noelle Blood Anderson is our communications manager. And not only are they responsible for pulling this event off tonight, but a good friend of mine, Don Pricer, I don't know if you know him, but he says one thing he noticed about me is I'm really good at putting together good teams. Well, here at One Omaha, I didn't have the privilege of putting together a team. There was one that was already made before I got here. But I am here to tell you that it is a phenomenal team. There is no great work that is done alone. And I am very, very appreciative to work with these two individuals who just bring so much value to everything that's going to be done and is being done with One Omaha. So let's give them some applause. Okay, so we got a lot to cover tonight. So let's just dive into some questions. And so as I ask these questions, it's gonna go kind of like on a timeline, right, as we go through it. So we're gonna start with Steve. Steve, can you describe how Omaha developed as a city in its first 100 years?
Well, it's kind of a long period of time, but I'll see if I can condense it a little bit. I think from the beginning of Omaha, one of the things to kind of understand is that within the region, the city of Bellevue was really the first community in the region. Council Bluffs followed that, and then Omaha. So Omaha was not the first of the cities here in the metropolitan area to exist, but it certainly became the largest of the cities. Part of the reason for that is that Bellevue was in a great location from the standpoint of being a place where fur trappers could do trading and so forth, because you had the confluence of several major rivers and streams, and that's how they moved around the wilderness at that time. Council Bluffs formed initially as a place for protection for a Native American tribe that had an ally with the U.S. government, and they had a blockhouse in Council Bluffs to help protect that tribe. But it was really formed in the kind of the very steep terrain that surrounds downtown Council Bluffs. And between there and the river was a big floodplain. And so when Omaha was formed, part of the reason that it was founded where it was is that it was there was a plateau that was just above the river. The river was, Omaha was on the kind of cutting edge of the river, so river boats could pull right up to the shore. And that plateau kept Omaha above the floodplain and kept it out of being flooded. One of the things that's interesting, if you look at some of the early bird's eye view drawings of Omaha, you'll see railroads right off the bat cutting off the access to the river from the town. You'll see what they call a skating pond, which happens to be exactly where Heartland of America Park's pond or lake is today. And so really the city was founded on that plateau. And initially it was able to grow kind of in a north-south fashion because as you went further to the west, you ran into the hills. So what I think is interesting then, kind of after the initial founding of Omaha, when it comes to kind of the form of Omaha physically, is that it was a new thing at the time Omaha was being formed to create a grid pattern of streets. That was kind of a new thing in the country. If you look at a lot of eastern cities, they're more like Council Bluffs with kind of winding roads that match the terrain. In Omaha, they put a grid of streets over the top of the terrain, almost ignoring the terrain. And so it is a different kind of development pattern. And then the other thing that then happened from there as Omaha developed is it started really with railroads being there very, very early on. And when you look at the form of cities prior to World War II, we moved all of our goods and products on rail. And so warehousing and housing in general and office buildings and so forth were all very much vertical in nature. And that's because they couldn't stray too far from those rail lines if it was a manufacturing facility. And then from the standpoint of moving around, we would have automobiles. And not everybody would have a horse or a horse and buggy because that would be very expensive. So people use streetcars to move around, and they use the rail to move goods and products. And so when you think about the form of Omaha and other cities that rely on rail, and that vertical nature of manufacturing and warehousing, there was kind of a good relationship between lower cost housing and its proximity and access to those jobs that were in those vertical warehouses and vertical manufacturing. Because you had density, you could ride on the streetcar, a fairly inexpensive way to get to work. It would be a short distance to get to work. Some of that lower cost housing was close to those manufacturing facilities. We had the largest lead smelter on the North American continent for a long period of time on the riverfront. So we had some kind of onerous, not very attractive uses. And so the housing that was close to those uses were lower cost houses. And you could get back and forth to those jobs pretty easily. But what happened after the World War II is that changed. And so the pattern of development changed, the way jobs where jobs were located changed, how you moved around changed, and that also changed the form of the city. But initially, it was a very dense and compact city that you could move around either by walking or using transit to get back and forth. And that pattern was something that I think worked well for the first 100 years of Omaha's existence, but that it changed pretty dramatically after that.
Thank you. Preston, we'll shift to you. Steve talked a little bit about streetcars being of use. Can you talk a little bit about what neighborhoods built along streetcar lines looked and felt like? What types of buildings, parks, and local businesses grew around them?
Well, just because I have gray hair doesn't mean that I know. I surely want to say, before I address your question, that I think Omaha, 1854, is that when we became a city? And this idea that you framed is very educational for us all, to have an educational framework for not only what, but the time frame, 1854, and then its evolution. The rail car began really with a horse. Before the rail, electric rail was transportation that provided transportation other than personal, was more of a horse-drawn piece. So that evolution. So to ask me what was going on in that time is looking at my gray hair thinking I was there. But with all that said, when I grew up, by the way, just for the record, my memory says that in North Omaha, which is my reference, the rail car, I think, ceased around the early 50s. And so, how old do you think I am? But I spent my first years, I'm 81 41, born in 1942. I grew up in North Omaha and grew up with the vision, without any understanding, historically or otherwise, of the electrical magic thing that would go down our corridor, 24th Street and later Lake Street, going north, south, and a little east-west. So I had up until the age of about 10, 11, the observation. But my historical references go beyond my personal observation. But the answer to your question is, you must understand when we ask that question that your tendency is to think of North Omaha as you see it today, where we have a vibrant, somewhat vibrant, but surely historical, culturally, and otherwise community of African Americans that were redlined into North Omaha. And so when you think of anything in and around that time, or now, you think of what we are as a community now. But, so when you ask what was the infrastructure, the housing that interacted with the rail car, you got to understand that African Americans were not on that corridor like you think of them today. There were businesses, there was housing, but it was not necessarily, while we had African Americans in the area, wasn't something that we related to in those days. And so and I don't want to get immediately too political, but by the end I probably will. But you must understand the why come to North Omaha with the rail in the first place. It was to accentuate the businesses. And in many cases, the stops were little economic hubs. But that wasn't really the African American experience, because we didn't have any businesses on those hubs. Are you with me?
Yes.
And so it was more of a novelty in a way, but African Americans surely used the transportation, but we used it in a different way than non-African Americans. If we're going to talk about the history, let's talk about it in the whole. And so I only give you that as a reference so that as we talk this through, you can make the distinctions between how the rail served North Omaha. You have to separate how the rail served all of North Omaha, and the red line African Americans were in there. It served us different. It did serve, but it was not, and I hate to do this to you, and I surely want to not move too fast to answer this question, but I surely want to thank and commend One Omaha, Alex, and you, Kimara, for having this discussion. We need to have this discussion. I don't know why you're here. Were you on your way somewhere else? Because we just discovered this wonderful space. But if you're here, I would almost, if we could, take the time, we won't, to find out why you're here. But maybe you're here to learn about cultures and history in the abstract, and to learn about all the pieces that interconnected to that. And we need to do that. I'm an advocate of the history and culture of things, and for it to be discussed, and for it to be revealed. But where I want to connect that with your question is there are lessons from the history once you learn it that you can apply to today. And so I think, and jumping way beyond your question, as we visualize the new rail system that is being, may I say, forced on us, but the new rail system that is being proposed, I see some correlations between that and the rail system that we're really here to talk about. Sure, certainly we might want to do some dot connection between the east-west proposed rail system that does not have a north-south thing. But actually, and you're the historian on the rail in a way, and that is that it started as a east-west and then added the north-south. So maybe there's hope in that, is my point. But the rail system was and is an opportunity to serve the communities in lots of ways. I won't go into that now, but to get to the bottom line on your question is we saw the rail system as African Americans in North Omaha as a way to just go from A to B. It didn't necessarily provide us a way to get the jobs because the jobs were not there in that way. There was not Google that we were trying to get to by rail. We were suffering to do domestic jobs and in many cases working on the other railroad. And so there was a way to get from some parts of the community to another part of the community by rail, but it wasn't the more profound transportation to get to and from work for African Americans, because to and from work was not available in the same way. You gotta understand that. And so, but it was a wonderful asset for us in just the fact that we could jump on that fun thing and ride it. And so when I was growing up, sometimes we jumped on and forgot to pay. but we sure. But it was a marvelous piece when you raise to the level, but let us not think that all the assets that the rail system has on its record apply to assets for the African American community.
Thank you, Preston. And contrary to popular belief, I encourage you to grab one of the flyers out there, one of the two for Preston. He provides tours because he does provide a lot of historical context, which is why we asked him, not because of that beautiful gray hair. So, we appreciate you because we are also here, as it says in our mission, to educate people. So this information is necessary. We appreciate it. Speaking of transportation, Dr. Crawford, can you explain broadly how transportation is linked to housing development?
Absolutely, and I want to thank both of my colleagues here for giving that historical context. One thing that Preston said in particular kind of leads us into this discussion about how transportation broadly is linked to housing development, particularly in Omaha, Nebraska. So I always like to look at it as policies, practices, and processes that were in place at that time, and we have to look at historically where we were in the 1930s, in the 1940s, and the 1950s. We were in a very racist country, a very segregated country, and all of those policies, practices, and processes were based on a racist ideology. So when Preston talked about being able to jump on the rail car and ride across town, once you jumped on that red car, if you were a person in the African American community, then you had to proceed to the back of the rail car if you were able to get on to the rail car. So we have to tie all of that to redlining because there is transportation redlining, there's digital redlining, there's housing redlining. So as we talk about how all of these are connected, and also what my colleague mentioned about us as a territory before we became a city, one of the one of the larger pieces of the conversation we have, if you come to the exhibit, is to talk about the Omaha Claim Club. So the Omaha Claim Club existed in this territory before we became what we now know as the city of Omaha and Bellevue and the surrounding area. The Omaha Claim Club was an organization that were the good citizens of the space at that time, where all of this property was in possession of the government. So when the property was in possession of the government, because we wanted people to come to this area, there was an opportunity to become landowners at no cost to you. So the government was basically giving away the land. You could show up, stake your claim, and farm the land became yours because you wanted to build this area. So the battle cry at that time was "Go West, young man," right? So when people started to show up in this area, and again, the historical context is, if you are black, if you are indigenous, or if you are of a certain ethnicity, then you were not included in those that were allowed to stake those claims. At the same time that we had the Omaha Claim Club, we also had land grant universities, which is our university where I work, University of Omaha at Nebraska. A land grant university also means where we decided to build the university was given to us. So anyone that was part of the Omaha Claim Club, you would get the property, and then you could go to the university and learn how to farm. So that's what created this great agricultural space that we have, is what we know as Omaha in this region, actually. As we are making those plans in the cities, we are also being redlined. So bring us back up to the 1930s, which is when redlining started, and I know we're going to talk some more about that later, but to put all of this in context, as the transportation began to develop in the city, and one of the atrocities of transportation for us in the city and cities across the country would have been the creation of the highway. For us, that was 75 North. What 75 North did is create a wonderful way to get out to the suburbs if you work downtown and along the riverfront the way you described it. It also, in its original plan, if it can be found, was that there were no exits. Originally, there was a plan to not have exits so that the good citizens who lived in suburbia could go to their jobs downtown, hop on the interstate, and bypass those areas of what was described as Negro infiltration, and we'll talk some more about that when we get to the redlining piece. So it would allow you to bypass those areas and go back out to suburbia. So I said all that to say, if you follow how transportation developed in the city and how housing developed in the city, both of them had some very racialized policies, practices, and other things that created these pockets of poverty that we now see in our city and cities across the nation today. All of it can be tied to redlining.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We are going to talk some more about redlining and the interstate. We also mentioned policies. So Steve, can you talk about how changing transportation policies were linked to changing land use policies, including suburbanization and lower density?
Sure. So we mentioned the interstate system for just a minute ago. So, really, as I mentioned earlier, in a physical sense, when the city was really built around rail transportation and therefore built in a very dense fashion, when we reached the 1960s following World War II, and so in the 1950s, but primarily in the 1960s, the nation went into the highway building business and built the interstate system. And so a big part of what happened at that time that we may not always have thought about was that we shifted in some ways, and in most ways, from moving goods and products by rail to moving goods and products by truck. And so if you put that together with the interstate system, part of what happened then is that you started to move those kinds of jobs and those kinds of businesses that were previously in a vertical manufacturing and warehousing configuration. And when you moved, which was necessary because you had this, had to have access to the rail, and rail didn't go everywhere. But streets go everywhere, and the interstate went to an awful lot of places, and so vertical warehousing manufacturing is not as efficient as horizontal warehousing and manufacturing. So all of those 6 and 8 story warehouses, so maybe an 8-story warehouse that covered maybe a quarter of a block in downtown Omaha, and where you manufactured Ford automobiles or later used that building as a warehouse, all of a sudden manufacturing and warehousing didn't make sense in that vertical configuration. So where you had 8 stories consuming only a quarter of a block, you now needed 2 square blocks for the same amount of square feet. Well, you can't find that in the urban area. And so what then happened is all of those jobs and all of those businesses moved to where you had rail. It now disconnected in many ways lower cost housing and blue collar jobs. And so that's an issue that cities across the country, including Omaha, had a problem with. The other problem that we had was what you were just talking about, and that was that this idea was that we were going to continue to grow in the core, in the downtown area, the same as we always had. So there was a plan, in Omaha's case, done in 1963. We had about 48,000 jobs in downtown Omaha at that time. The expectation was that we were going to grow in terms of jobs to over 60,000 jobs by 1980. We had about 27,000 parking stalls in downtown at that time, and the expectation was that if we're going to add all these jobs, we probably need to add a few thousand more parking stalls. And then to make it easier to get in and out of downtown with all of these cars that everybody was buying after World War II, well, then we would need to go through the downtown area and around the city, and we would need to expand that interstate system and provide a loop into downtown, and then branches off of that loop into North Omaha and West Omaha and so Council Bluffs and so forth, to get all of these new jobs in and out of downtown. What actually ended up happening, though, is we spent a lot of money on those highways and had detrimental impacts, particularly to North Omaha from one of those highways, and other neighborhoods were able to stop them, and so those interstate extensions weren't built, and in other neighborhoods in the city. But what's interesting to me is that we didn't grow from 48,000 jobs to 60,000 jobs. We actually lost about 21,000 jobs in downtown. And we added, instead of a few thousand parking stalls, we added about 13 or 14,000 parking stalls. So we started to replace jobs with housing, replace jobs with parking in our downtown area. And when you think about the numbers and you look at the number of parking stalls in downtown in that 1963 plan and the number of jobs, what it meant was that maybe 25,000 cars came in and out of downtown every day, going to and from work. So we thought, well, we're going to have to add all of this additional highway capacity because we're going to add all these jobs, we're going to add thousands of new cars. But at the end of the day, when we lost all of those jobs and you dropped to the 27,000 jobs, you still had about 25,000 cars coming in and out of downtown. But we built I-480, we built the North Freeway, so we built all of this capacity, but because of the cars, we've dropped the density of downtown and just built parking instead. And so that's another aspect of the streetcar and investment and so forth, but it did change. And then also all of that interstate expansion just exacerbated and pushed people into a lower density pattern of development in suburban areas because now everybody was driving a car, and we converted all of our commercial to businesses where you could drive through to get food, you could drive through to get your dry cleaning, you could drive through and drive by everything, and there was plenty of free parking. So all of that changed the whole dynamic in terms of development. It changed where developers put their money, and it changed the density of the city. And basically, a suburban area is about half as dense as, say, Dundee or areas of the older parts of the city that were built around transit. And so it really changed the whole nature of development in the city and across the country.
Yeah, this is why it's so needed to have the conversation. As I listen to you, I hear and see visually in my mind everything that you said. As a young man growing up, I remember uniquely downtown and when it was vibrant. Of course, my grandmother worked as an elevator operator, and some of downtown was not accessible by black folks. Did you know? But in spite of that, I said when I opened up that this education is vital to your understanding, because once you hear the history, the question is, what do you get out of that will help us today? One of the things that I get out of your eloquent description is mistakes that were made. And some of the mistakes, and by brilliant people and good people, don't get me wrong, but one of the residuals of racism, and we like to use DEI, but diversity, inclusion, and equity, is in the planning process. Nobody from, and I'm over dramatic here, nobody from North Omaha was consulted about the thinking process or the planning process. And I say that as a generalization. I want to leave that there, but I want to come back to it to say we've got to learn from that lesson. Because what we saw in that same history, we African Americans, is another thing that hasn't come up yet, which is, and why the shift caught you by surprise, so to speak, and I'm being over dramatic, is that what was going on is white people were trying to get out of the areas that blacks were coming. There is a name called white flight, and so they flew out of and left downtown. That's part of that formula, is they moved while it looked like downtown was going to grow, and be vibrant. What happened in the midst of all of that was black folks were getting bigger and bigger in our community, and white folks are moving out further west. Within any smart business would start moving out west with them, and they did, and what that did is then it left downtown shivering. And so that shifted what happened. And it might not have been clear at that time. It's clear now. And so let's not forget that, because the good can be bad and ugly at the same time. And so I remember Brandeis and some of the downtown, but then it shifted as white people shifted to 72nd and Dodge and the Crossroads. And then that shifted, and that is still, ladies and gentlemen, shifting. And so my point is, had there been consultation with some of the players in the formula, in other words, black people, it might have been thought through another way. Nobody meant any harm as you planned the downtown growth. But it was there looking right at you. White folks were getting out of Dodge, and they weren't going to be downtown anymore. All right. And so what's the lesson out of that? And I'll turn it back. The lesson out of that is development is going on every day. North Omaha is getting ready to receive $300 million. What are we going to do? Well, I'm not applauding yet. I'm grateful too, but that money, $300 million, could be misused.
Oh, true.
And so we because you're missing my point. I'm not poo-pooing the 300 million. I want it before, but I want it, okay? I'm just saying the thinking process of how that money is used is the same thinking process that needed to take place when we're planning stuff for downtown when actually folks are going west. Okay, I'm saying because you must involve all the players.
Right.
We're not, and I will close, but we're not involving the players like we should on the 300 million. We're setting ourselves up maybe for wasting that $300 million. That's why I'm not applauding yet. So, sorry.
And that is not me disagreeing with you, Preston, that's just me getting the hook, because we already know it's a very serious discussion, there's a lot to be said, and so I appreciate that, and I definitely respect it. I want to, if we could, shift to a conversation about redlining. Dr. Crawford, would you, first of all, give us an overview of what redlining is and how it created racial discrimination in mortgage lending and banking policies?
Okay. So we all know about Jim Crow, about segregation, about what that looked like in our country in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and well into the 70s. So that historical piece, I think everyone in this room is going to have that. So if you think about what was explicit racism, we knew what that looked like. So we'll talk about this Negro infiltration and some other terminology that was given to the masses by the federal, state, and local government when we were assessing properties in these communities. So we'll stick a pin in that for a moment to get back to this definition. So we know about all of those things, right? So explicit racism now becomes structural. And the structural is a policy, a practice, and a process that I will continue to talk about because now it is embedded in every single process in all of these communities that were redlined. That includes the educational process. That includes health outcomes. You talked about Sarko and how they were on the riverfront for over 100 years. That was a smelting plant, which means they had contaminants in the environment that rested in North Omaha and they poisoned the community for over 100 years. And all of the players, I like to call them the cast of characters, all of the cast of characters, federal, state, and local government knew it, but there were several companies, and we all know who they are. One of them is a power company, and one of them is a railroad. I won't mention names, okay? But we do know that each of those companies, and it's in the public record, okay? Each of those companies became very wealthy by being engaged in business with Sarko. But we know Sarko was poisoning northeast, and portions of South Omaha in particular. And we know that to be true because the Environmental Protection Agency told us so. And they gave us a designation as a Superfund site. So when we take all of those practices that were very racialized, restrictive covenants, all of those were explicit racism, they now become structural. And one of those policies that came out of that structural racism was redlining. Redlining was a policy that relegated particular spaces and communities across the country designated only for what were considered to be hazardous. And when they said hazardous, although there were environmental hazards there, they didn't mean the environment, they meant the people. And when I say they, this is how it happened, right? So surveyors showed up in these cities across the country. The surveyors had been trained by the federal government from an organization known as HOLEC, and we'll get to that in a moment also. So these surveyors are trained, they kind of spread out across the country, and they do assessments of the worth of your property and whether or not it's worthy of banking and mortgage, right? So that assessment at that time meant that they actually knocked on doors and they did a visual inspection of who lived there. And that visual inspection had to do whether or not this Negro infiltration or foreign-born infiltration was another term that was used, right? Lived in these homes. And as soon as they made those assessments, then they had their little clipboards and they would make a determination as to what your race is and how valuable your property is. So now property and race become synonymous. based on this policy of redlining across the country. So that's how we got into this debacle, right? And what it did is created these pockets of poverty that still exist today. So one of the things we did with the redlining exhibit is to take those maps from the 1930s and juxtapose that over the maps from the 2020 census. Because we just wanted to make a comparison to see whether or not there have been any changes in those pockets of poverty and all those other practices that existed in the 1930s in those areas. And you can guess what happened, right? We juxtaposed those maps, those 2020 maps, over those 1930s maps, and there was absolutely zero change. That means in Omaha, in Lincoln, and also in Council Bluffs, but across the country, the same was also true. So that means, I know you said, my colleague, that a lot of this was by mistake and that we didn't include individuals. My position, because I am Malcolm leaning, is that this was totally strategic. It was a policy. It came from the federal government. It was enforced by the Supreme Court. And then it was distributed out to all of the states as to this is our practice. And racial covenants shall be the law of the land to prevent Black individuals and indigenous individuals from living in certain neighborhoods. So when we originally redlined Omaha, Nebraska, I don't want to go over, but I got to get this in, right? So when we originally redlined Omaha, Nebraska, it was a very small area, and then it expanded over time. So it started at Cummings Street and went to Spray, northward, and 38th Street and eastward to the river. That was a very small area, but that was very intentional because there's a conglomerate right on Cummings Street that disallowed us from going southward, which is why we went north. In case you don't know what that conglomerate is, that's Creighton University. Creighton University has been around in the city since the 1800s, right? So they were intentionally left outside of the red line. So if we go to 38th Street, we went eastward to the river because, again, there were some organizations, some families that we know as founding families that were in that area that were intentionally left outside of that red line. That included Cathedral. That included DeSharon Academy. That included Jocelyn Castle. And that whole area that we know as the Gold Coast today, a lot of those very exclusive houses still today, all of those were part of that original red line that excluded those, and then it expanded northward over time. So that gives my definition of redlining and what happened, and I'll stop there if I need to.
I'm not going to take a long piece, but I want to add to your eloquence just some practical things people may not know about redlining. Just a couple. If you were Black and you wanted to buy or rent, the practical implications of being redlined is if you had a house that was outside of that red line and you wanted to buy it, if you had the money, whatever, but you had to borrow some money, the bank would look at where it was on a map, in some cases on the wall, with the red line pencil in, and say, we don't loan money to Blacks outside. It's too much of a risk. Or
They refuse to lend.
well, maybe I said it nicely. They refused. So that was the practical nature. I just want to put the conceptual part into that's how it was enforced. Is renting and buying was prohibited, and I'll add as I pass the mic that the insurance companies would not insure it either.
Yes, and with our, I'm sorry.
It was even in the documents.
Absolutely. We have to go for it. I do encourage you, though, to go to UNO and participate in the Red Line exhibit. I took a group of friends out there. It is a phenomenal tour. Dr. Crawford gives so much information, so I encourage you to take some time, chat with her afterwards, go out there to the exhibit. It is amazing information. We do not have enough time in one night to really dive off into it. I wish that we did. We are going to shift a little bit and talk about the interstate that continues to come up, the interstate. So Steve, can you explain how the interstate, and I hate to do this, but let's limit our answers if we can to about 3 minutes. But can we explain how the interstate affected the development of Omaha?
Well, sure. As we said earlier, the interstate allows you to move over greater distances more quickly, and so it just exacerbated this move to the suburbs that we've talked about, and so made it easier for you to move further and further and further away from the urban core. And that still affects us today in terms of where businesses want to locate. When we talk to businesses today and say, look, we would love to see you come downtown, or stay in downtown, oftentimes they'll say, well, all of our people live out west, so maybe we'll move out west. And so the interstate really facilitated this move to the suburbs, and it was very much a part of the culture of the time. The whole Chevrolet commercials of the day were see the USA in your Chevrolet, and they show people riding on the interstate and having a wonderful time. And so it was seen as this great, wonderful thing for the country. But it did move everybody to a lower density pattern of development. It moved new development further and further from the older parts of cities, and it exacerbated many of the things we're talking about in terms of loss of jobs in older parts of the city, businesses moving out, the retail moving out, and so you didn't have all those goods and services and jobs in the central city that you had at that time, because they've now moved out to the suburbs where you can move around more freely in your car.
Right. Okay. Preston and Terri, can you expand a little bit more on the construction of the interstate and how that affected neighborhoods in East Omaha?
Yes, I'd love to. And I'm going to do it in how many minutes? No, that's well, maybe the way for me to answer the question is to talk about where my dad and his family grew up. They lived in the area, and next door was another poor family, and next door was another. And guess what they had? They had a neighborhood. They had a relationship, social, and one loaned a cup of sugar, and they became a unit, if you will, both formal and informal. And down the road was a little bitty, I wouldn't even want to say a store, but it was a place where they could get something. It was right in the neighborhood, run by somebody maybe out of their base, something. It was a cohesive thing, and it was culturally connected. Are you all with me so far? Well, when the freeway was built, it tore that completely apart. There was no connection to building that was there before. Families who were almost family, even though not blood related, were separated. Separated. And all of that. I think the number is someone in the area of 1,100 homes, not people, but homes, were displaced. And I don't think that we have time to develop if they were displaced properly, but they were displaced. So, but all of that cultural trauma and economic trauma and neighborhood trauma and community trauma was the result, simply stated in 2.5 minutes, by the freeway.
Policies, practices, and processes, okay? So none of this happened in a vacuum, and you're absolutely right. In the name of urban development and eminent domain, 1,100 houses were taken in North Omaha by 75 North. That destroyed families. It destroyed the opportunity to create generational wealth, because when those homes were destroyed by the interstate, they were replaced with public housing. Public housing does not allow an opportunity for the residents to create any generational wealth. It stacks people on top of each other like sardines, in high-rise businesses. The developers become very rich, and individuals who once had those corner stores and those family businesses are now destroyed because the urban development had a battle cry once again: we're destroying the slums. And it's all in the research. Please come to the exhibit. That we destroyed these 1,100 homes. We never rebuilt them. We displaced individuals, families, and generations, and we stole the opportunity to build generational wealth, which has never returned to North Omaha and many other North Omahas across the country.
And as she passes back, just very briefly, you must understand something. I'm just underlining something she said, which is how partly a major component of building wealth is purchasing property that you own, that is developed by your generation. When you cut that, it can't be restored.
Thank you. Thank you. We are going to shift again. And Steve, this question is, can you talk a little bit about sanitary improvement districts and how they encourage certain types of development in Omaha?
Sure. Omaha has some kind of unique policies compared to other cities in the country. And I'll get to sanitary improvement districts in just one second. One of the things that Omaha can do that virtually no other city in the country can do is we can annex other communities up to a population of 10,000 without a vote of the people in that community. It's just a vote of the city council of the city of Omaha. So Omaha has become a collection of cities. But the other thing that Omaha has used in terms of development and growth has been the sanitary improvement district. The original intent of the sanitary improvement district was that there were a few wealthy developers who were able to afford to do development, to purchase property, to install streets and so forth, and then sell houses. And so the initial idea behind the sanitary improvement district was not necessarily a bad idea. It was that if you could finance that development in a different way, you may not have to use your own personal wealth to do it. And so what was created was a mechanism where a developer could purchase property and then float essentially municipal bonds, tax-free municipal bonds, just like a city could, to put in the roads and the sewers and the parks and all of the things that a city would otherwise build. And the thought behind it was, well, if you have this tool available, you don't necessarily have to have as much money, because now you have this tool that would allow you to do development. Part of the problem is that what that also meant was that those wealthier developers who could do the work before now didn't have to use their own personal wealth to do that development and pay for the streets and the sewers and the parks and so forth. They could use this other mechanism. So many times what happened was they instead just went out and bought more land, and therefore controlled the amount of development much the same way as they did before. So not all were that way. There were certainly others who got into the business who couldn't have otherwise. But the other thing that it did was it really facilitated suburban development. So it made it easier to do suburban development. It made it faster and cheaper to do because you could do larger tracts of land. You could develop more streets and sewers and so forth at one time and make more lots available. And so that, combined with these other things we've talked about, really has pushed a lot of suburban development in Omaha. Now, I will say early on, there were a lot of abuses of that sanitary improvement district where they built things that weren't really the right thing to build. They may have built essentially a private type of pool or clubhouse, and that's not really the intent of SIDs. Most all of those abusive activities have been eliminated. There's a lot of study that's done on every project that comes in to make sure that what they're doing is appropriate and it's monitored. So we've eliminated a lot of that negative, but it is part of what has allowed for development in suburban Omaha. One other big thing that we have to look at, and it affects development in the region going forward, and that is that in the 1960s, what we had in Omaha and in Sarpy County was we had a lot of small, what were called package treatment plants that would do sort of an initial level of sewage treatment, and then they would dump the sewage, the somewhat treated sewage into the Papillion Creek watershed or into the stream. So what the federal government did at that time was it came to Omaha and said, look, the Papillion Creek watershed and all of the streams are polluted because of all these little package treatment plants. We'll give you money from the federal government to build a large treatment facility at the mouth of the Papillion Creek where it enters the Missouri River. We'll pay to run huge trunk lines upstream to the location of all these small plants. We'll shut down those plants, and now we'll provide a better level of treatment at this plant along the Missouri River and discharge that treated waste into the river, and it would clean up the Papillion Creek watershed. But what it also did was, they said, Omaha, you have to become a regional sewer provider. So anyone in the Papillion Creek watershed who wants to connect into that system, you have to agree to serve them. Of course, it has to make economic sense. But that has also allowed for the suburbanization of Omaha and Sarpy County. And so again, just another tool that has allowed that kind of suburban pattern of development to occur. But it is also something that will come to an end soon. And it is something that's going to impact Omaha's growth going forward when we reach the upper reaches of that Papillion Creek watershed, where you can no longer just extend sewers and have that sewage flow to that plant. When that day comes, Omaha will effectively stop growing on the suburban fringe. And that's one of the big issues we have going forward for the city of Omaha. It's really the biggest issue that needs to be addressed in the new comprehensive plan that will be created, because Omaha will become like most other major American cities in the sense that it will not be able to grow outwardly as it has over the last, well, at the time it stops, probably about 200 years old. And so when that day comes, we have to make sure that our oldest neighborhoods and the oldest parts of the city are as healthy as possible, because if we don't, then we aren't going to be able to annex those new areas and bring in that valuation and pay for all of the things we need to do, and we'll be stuck with an aging infrastructure and a fixed tax base that usually in most cities begins to decline. So we have to not make that happen, let that happen. We have to start taking steps now to make sure that doesn't happen in the future.
I just want to say briefly, at the time that all these things were happening, wonderful things that were happening in Papillion and the cleanup and the sewage and all of that, simultaneous with what was happening there, the poisoning continued in Northeast Omaha, right? The EPA really didn't show up and give us that Superfund site designation for North and Northeast Omaha until the late 1990s. And in fact, there was litigation to resolve that, if it can be resolved, right, into 2020. So none of this happens in a vacuum. We show that certain parts of our city and our region are more valuable based on who lives there and based on your zip code. Part of a process and a policy.
If I could? Okay. I think it's important, quite frankly. It's like you tee us up. That we
So you're saying blame Steve?
we swing it. But I just, you gotta understand this, that when I listen to this scenario, there's nothing wrong with it except there was a consequence. And the consequence was and is that North Omaha, as we talked SIDs and North Omaha in my lifetime, has never had any significant, maybe I can remove the word significant, development. None of the techniques were used in North Omaha all of my life. And I only going to live 100 more years, so maybe it might work out. But my point is, for 50 years, we have not had any development. None of the techniques even 10 and some of the others have been used. So I've watched buildings in North Omaha stay the same since I was a kid. And so I could develop, I know we don't have the time, but it is, you gotta understand that. And so when we look at the advent of maybe $300 million, it's a drop in the bucket, but we're thankful. But not only that, is we gotta look at the bucket and make sure that when we drop it in there, that the bucket doesn't have a hole in it. Because that $300 million has come after a generation of no investment. We gotta get it right. And we started wrong on that money. And that's another meeting. But we got it. How many of y'all, let me see, I can't always see well, but I gotta get every one of your names. How many read my editorials in the world? But I just wrote it. Okay. But I wrote an article about that, and I urge you to read it to see the context of where I'm coming from. We're happy to get $300 million, but we gotta be smart while we get it. So.
Well, I think that is a perfect time for me to say, first of all, let's give our panelists just a round of applause. I wanted to make sure that we left time so that our audience can be able to ask you questions. So at this time, what I would like to do is open up the floor for that. I can see people in here. Hello, everyone. So yeah, we're gonna open up the floor for questions right now, so please. If anyone has a question, I think the acoustics in here are phenomenal, so we should be able to hear you. So by all means, and if not, I might have a couple.
I have a question.
Yes, feel free to stand up, or if you're able, and just ask.
You spoke about these power companies and also the railroads that benefited from our SAR bill. But what kind of people were working at those places? What kind of people were working at those opportunities, had opportunities to work at, building the highways that caused those problems? They were not minority group people.
That's absolutely true.
They were not given opportunities in that time, back in the 50s and 60s. And you also see, one thing that I always see, is 16th Street and 24th Street cannot go straight through north to south. And I know you know that. And you were there when that building was built.
So the first part of that question, you're absolutely right. There were exclusionary practices that did not allow blacks and other ethnicities to work for Osarco and some of the other companies that we talked about. At that time, they could not be members of the union, and they could not get any of those jobs because, of course, discrimination was rampant on the job at that time, and it was perfectly legal. So did they work at Osarco and some of the other companies that were poisoning the communities that they lived in? Absolutely not. But let me say this part of North Omaha, though, during that time, there was industry that was plentiful, in addition to what Preston described, the mom and pop shops. But we had lots of industry on North 30th, North 24th Street, and North 16th Street. Buttermilk plant, Pepsi bottling company, Fest bottling company, Coca-Cola, lots of industry. So jobs were plentiful, and if you lost a job down the block, you could walk down several other blocks and find another job. So when redlining occurred, we had white flight, we also had capital flight that left the area and never returned. So I'll let you take a piece about why, and also urban development, city planning, as to why 16th Street was closed off.
Well, in essence, the time to build a hotel to stop black folks from going downtown.
Okay. Another question.
Thank you.
Yes.
I've lived in North Omaha for probably about 33 years now. And I believe that redlining is still in effect in regards to insurance.
Oh, insurance.
And it just makes me angry. How does that get addressed?
Well, we started having this
And
conversation.
something very profound that is also the new redlining. Domino's won't deliver pizza.
Yeah, oh,
That is true. There's some
It all stems from that policy, practice, and the process, and you're absolutely right. Your zip code matters. For insurance purposes, your life expectancy is different depending on your zip code. So redlining set up the policy, and because it is structural, it is more difficult to spot than something that is very explicit racism. So if it's built into every single system, think about what our educational outcomes look like in North Omaha, and what policing looks like in North Omaha, and what a non-full service hospital that used to be on North 30th Street that is now condos used to look like in North Omaha. So you are absolutely right. The impact of redlining continues to have the same effect on all of these communities across the nation. It is structural. And in order for us to deal with it, we have to dismantle that structure. We don't want to fix it because it's doing what it was designed to do. We have to deconstruct it, dismantle it, and build something else. But we have to recognize that it is absolutely there. And just real quickly, I grew up right over on 33rd and Hamilton Street. So all of the area that we're in right now, Blackstone, Midtown, all of that is North Omaha. We changed the names because it needed to be more palatable to developers. So Blackstone is a beautiful area now. This is North Omaha. This was my stomping ground. I went to Tech High School. That was my high school. That is now a tech building, right? All of this is North Omaha, but it's now called something else. North Downtown, that is North Omaha. So why did we have to change what it sounds like and the appeal that it has to developers in order for us to get some of that development that you talked about that has not created the spaces that is done westward by leaps and bounds, right? This whole annexation principle that we use, we are we to 300 something X streets? I know we're at least 200 and something, right? So we have grown by leaps and bounds westward and continue to grow westward, right? That development is not happening in North Omaha, and it could and it should. I'll pass it.
One thing I'd like to add when we talk about some of this, and I think it's a hidden thing about downtown that I think we all have to recognize and understand. One of the hidden things about losing the jobs in downtown and building so much parking is if you look at the aerials of downtown from the 1940s, you see almost no parking in downtown at all. You see a handful of off-street parking lots, and that's all. Every other square inch of downtown had a building that paid taxes. Today, if you look at the same areas of downtown, it's covered, about half of downtown is covered with nothing but parking lots, and they pay nothing in taxes, virtually nothing in taxes. And then we have a lot of public facilities in downtown that of course pay nothing in taxes. So when you think about all of the jobs that were downtown and all of those buildings that were there that housed those jobs and the residential that was in downtown, that they all pay taxes, but in that downtown setting, they didn't produce children. So what they produced was a lot of tax revenue for OPS, so that OPS could provide better schools and good education. As you lose all of those buildings and all of those jobs and you turn them into parking lots, you no longer have what essentially was a cash cow for OPS. You no longer have the revenue that came from that downtown area. And so it's one of the things that we have been working on. It's I think one of the misunderstood parts of the streetcar is that it is an effort to try to stop building more parking, to be able to more efficiently use the parking we have, not build new parking, and so that we can begin to turn that back into tax-paying property that then has these other benefits, one of which is a benefit to OPS, which then helps all of these older neighborhoods by being able to provide more money for schools without necessarily providing more children that need the education. So it's a kind of a hidden thing that I think we really have to understand, and why that's so important to change that dynamic in downtown.
we have two questions in the back. I'll go right here and then.
Okay, mine's really not a question. Just sitting here listening to you all, you all started talking about 1963. That's when I started school. And so, listening to you all talk, I saw how the neighborhoods evolved. Now, I remember riding the bus downtown, and I remember when downtown became a ghost town. And I also remember having friends whose parents worked for Keywood and Hawkins Construction Company, and they moved out of our neighborhood and moved to a place called Breton. I didn't have a clue what Breton is, but now we see what Breton is. And then you mentioned about the transportation. I remember when the bus stopped at 48th and Ames. I tried to get a job as a teenager at Burger King on 60th and Ames. In order to get to Burger King, I had to get off the bus at 48 and walk. But you know what? I ended up having to quit the job because I was walking home and someone shot out of their car an air gun. So that immediately just distinguished me in wanting to work. And then when you all were talking about the parking stalls, the parking stalls, to me, when you said they built the parking stalls for cars, while they were building the parking stalls for cars, the white people that we had in our neighborhood moved. So I just saw that correlation. And I have friends who live in the area east of 30th Street that had to move because of the North Freeway. And then now I'm listening, I'm living in a house, paying a mortgage. Now the money in which the state, federal, and city allowed we say SIDs to be able to develop, now to recoup the money in which was misused, they're on the back of lower middle class income people. They're raising our taxes up and trying to justify it. But in my mind, listening to you all, they're trying to recoup what they gave away long time ago and refused people who lived in North Omaha to be able to have because of the redlining.
One quick thing I want to say about SIDs, just to clarify on SIDs, it is money that is essentially borrowed by the developer and essentially investors buy bonds that then pay for that infrastructure. As development occurs and houses are built and taxes are paid, the taxes from those new housing units and stores and restaurants and so forth, it's that tax revenue from that area that goes to pay off those bonds. The city, the government doesn't give them money to develop out there. It's the private sector that buys the bonds, and then the taxes in that SID pay back those bonds. So you're right about government investments in roadways and interstates and all those kinds of things that push a lot of that development in that direction. But SIDs themselves are financing mechanisms where the taxes within that area pay off those bonds. Not our tax dollars don't go to do that. So I just want to make sure everybody understood that.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. We're going to go over here, Amy, and then, I'm sorry, Spencer in the back.
Hi, thank you all for speaking. This has been really informative. I'm going to totally cheat Kimara, and I'm going to ask 2 questions. So, Steve, you talked about the parking situation. Now, city code requires when you do a development and you build a building, depending on the occupancy, determines the amount of parking that's required. So if we know historically that that's been an issue, how is city code being corrected?
In downtown and midtown, we have not required parking since the 1980s.
Okay.
So new development in those areas does not require any parking. Lenders who give the developers the money, they'll say, we want to make sure you've got enough parking, so they'll build parking primarily because it's something lenders want to make sure is there as a part of their investment.
But then as you build further out, where it is still a requirement, it seems like we're not learning from the lessons.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, we could eliminate parking minimums everywhere and go to parking maximums. And I don't think we'd see, you know, if we got rid of parking minimums, I don't think we'd see any change because the lenders and the investors would want all that parking. If we went to parking maximums, then we would see a change.
And then really quick, do you see there being any sort of technique or mechanism similar to an SID that can be, used in North Omaha?
I mean, that's the problem is we essentially, government has the ability to float bonds and do that same work. And so in theory, the government does that in the city. And then there's the tax increment financing mechanism, which is about the only mechanism we have. And the idea behind TIF is that when you invest in the property and increase the value, you're going to increase the amount of taxes you pay. So for a period of time, you get to use that increased tax revenue to pay for some of the expenses of that development. And that's about the only thing we really have.
There's only been one quick that I can think of.
And then, I'm sorry, Preston, we have one more question in the back.
No problem.
Yes, Preston.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. It's been incredible. Thanks for putting the event on. And it's evident that the three of you know your stuff. Like, this can be very impactful for our community. I think everybody in the room might say this is very educational. We now have a better understanding of housing and how it can develop going forward. I'm curious to each of your perspective, what do we do? We're not the experts. We're in the communities. You've seen this. You've seen problems over the course of your own lifetime and within these communities become worse. What were people doing then? What was the shortcoming? How do we act differently? What do we do when we walk out of this board?
My short answer, and this is a question that I initiate, the answer I initiate all the time, is this is only a thin slice of the bigger pie. And so each slice has its own same attributes. Oh my goodness, what do we do? And that is, don't try to solve the pie. Just focus in on things that touch you mentally or physically and get involved.
I would have to say that you are the experts. I'm an expert in, and I hate to use lanes because I have many lanes and I think everyone does. But you are the experts. I think we always use an asset-based community engagement framework. That means you are the assets in the community, you are the experts, and guess what? Show up at city council, show up at the legislature, knock on the doors of your representative. What is going on with the county commissioners? Why does my neighborhood look the way it does compared to Elmwood Park, for instance? You have to be your own advocates in your neighborhoods, through your neighborhood associations, and let your voice be heard.
I would echo both of the comments made. I think that what you're doing here tonight is the most important thing. Learn about what the issues are, how we got to where we are, what some of the solutions are, and then do exactly what you said. Then go talk to your council member, go talk to your representatives and tell them, here's what I think we should do. So first you have to.
It's gonna be like a mosquito in their ear.
So first you have to become educated to the issues and how you make change, and then you execute that.
I'm sorry.
I have a question, but just kind of on that. So another way you could get involved in kind of a shameless plug for MAPA. So MAPA has Heartland 2050, and they have both a housing and development committee and an equity and engagement committee. I share the second one. But we have meetings every month where we do talk about a lot of the things that are going on regionally as far as development. They're open to the public to join and learn and find ways for you to advocate. Both of those groups, Just East chairs the housing and development one. we both would love to talk more and having you in that committee so you can take this information and this learning and do something with it as well. So just another avenue, sorry, I know we're at that.
Yes, yes. Well, let's give them a round of applause. Highly informational. Thank you for answering these really extremely thought-provoking questions. I just want to leave you all with this. Tonight, we engage in something I have to bring up in conversation almost everywhere I go. One, we engage in a level of learning. Two, just by being here in each other's spaces, we're really building relationships, right? Strengthening relationships. We've also increased our individual capacity tonight. I think also, once you leave tonight and you go home and you look and you see if you belong to your neighborhood association, then you realize you don't, you reach back out and you say, hey, I want to join my neighborhood association, right? We're also doing what we say is creating that meaningful sense of community ownership. When you increase knowledge, when you strengthen relationships, when you build capacity and create that sense of meaningful community ownership, those are also precursors to systemic change. So that is what we have engaged in tonight. We certainly hope that you will come back and join us in October and November to learn more about how you all can be change makers when it comes to Omaha's housing development. So you will be receiving an email from us tomorrow with a post-assessment. Please take the post-assessment, and that is for us so that we can really gauge how effective our programming is in delivering the information you need to know about how you can grow and be more involved in your community. So I am just so excited and happy to see all of your beautiful, wonderful, lovely faces out there. Again, thank you for attending, and before Noel says it, we are leaving here promptly at 8 o'clock tonight. So thank you so much.